Hello, welcome to MMO Weekly. This is brought to you by MetsmerizedOnline.com. I'm Patrick Lynn. I'm in for Sal Manzo, who's off on vacation this week. I'm an editor at Metsmerized, and we're joined by Mike Mayer, who is the executive editor. I'm sorry, at Metsmerized. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing very well. The last couple days, I've felt very invigorated by baseball because of the World Baseball Classic. Between the Japan and Mexico game on Monday night, and then Japan versus the United States on Tuesday night, um, I obviously had some level of rooting interest. I wanted Jeff McNeil to play and Pete Alonso to play, and I wanted them to play well. But even in the last couple of World Series where the Mets haven't been in it and their season's been done, I've felt like I've had a rooting interest in those sort of things. And I feel like the last couple of days, I haven't had a rooting interest. I've just been able to enjoy it. And it really kind of ignited really just the love I've had for the game. So yeah, just really happy to almost be at actual MLB baseball season, Major League Baseball season. And yeah, how about you? Enjoyed the World Baseball Classic, I assume?
Yeah, I mean, if you follow me on Twitter, you've certainly seen everyone's seen that how much I like the World Baseball Classic. I've been pushing it the whole time, even as after the unfortunate Edwin Diaz injury. Um, yeah, I think it's kind of weird now that we're in the spot where now we're just back to spring training games, like boring spring training games, like this lull before this week before the season starts. But I can't I can't imagine like anyone thinking about, even as I was ramping up coverage for the WBC and we were getting everyone to write about different teams and the pool play and kind of previewing all the teams. Um, I don't think anyone could have really predicted World Baseball Classic, A, just being this good. The competition itself was really good. And just the level of viewership, it's done great. I mean, we're talking about games that have outdone, I mean, World Series games, games that have outdone every NBA game this year, including the All-Star game. Um, and that's just counting like in the US too, and then talk about like what the viewership has been in other countries, like 96% in Japan for the title game and Taiwan um, watching at record levels. It's just, I know it's a little tougher for some Mets fans to kind of really enjoy what happened. And you can't blame them. I mean, Edwin Diaz, the Mets star closer being out for the year, is certainly it's a tough pill to swallow. But once you kind of get past that, if you can, and just watch the games, I mean, the games themselves have just been incredible. There really hasn't been a ton of blowouts in like the big games outside of like U.S. beating up on Cuba. I think that was kind of expected because Cuba kind of backed into that position that they were
Yeah.
into. But other than that, I mean, the game's been terrific. There's been so many good storylines. Matt Harvey, kind of, I mean, not the velocity still not there for Matt Harvey, but he essentially pitched Italy into the next round. I mean, they
Hmm.
were, could argue, the best team in that pool, and just kind of got a bad draw of playing against Japan in the quarterfinals. But Matt Harvey gave up one run in 7 innings. I mean, it's tough, regardless of how he got there. It's tough to argue with the results. And Mike Piazza managing that team, the kid from Nicaragua that got signed before he left the stadium after pitching against big leaguers and pitching really well. There's just, I mean, the Mets signed a guy that pitched for Team Israel. Um, and that's without getting into like all the crazy stuff of Trey Turner hitting 5 home runs.
Turns into
Um,
Barry Bonds.
yeah, Randy Arozarena seemingly doing everything right and
Hmm.
put it showing off his personality
Yeah.
on just the national stage. I mean, he was signing autographs during like pitching changes out in left field. There's just it's stuff that you can't see during a major league game, or you not can't, but stuff that we haven't seen. I mean, just the crowds alone. I remember when I tweeted out like the cheerleaders and the crowds going crazy in Taiwan during a game there, and Mets owner Steve Cohen was like, is that in Japan? And like wondering where it was because he was intrigued by just the
Yeah.
level of excitement that was going on during a baseball game. And that only got better when games went to Miami and you had Puerto Rico playing the Dominican Republic, and I mean even the like Mexico U.S. I mean these were just it was just incredible games, incredible crowds, and I mean really outside of the Edwin Diaz thing, I think it's been a grand slam for baseball. It's been a grand slam for baseball in a global sense. I mean, this grew baseball fans. I mean, we don't know it right away, but this is the type of thing that's going to really help kind of spread the voice of baseball. And
Yes.
ultimately, I mean, again, it's tough to say we're a Mets podcast, but ultimately, that that is more important than what happened to Edwin Diaz in the long term. Obviously, the short term, it really sucks for the Mets. He's a tough guy to replace, but in the long term, growing baseball more globally is what it's all about. I mean, we want to get into these other countries. I mean, having the Czech Republic win a game and just seeing those guys that were teachers and surgeons and just different levels of everyday jobs play on that type of stage and win is just incredible story. Um, yeah, I mean, there, I can't, like I said, I just can't imagine it going better outside of the DS thing. And it was good. I think from a standpoint you'd like to see, you'd like you mentioned Pete Alonso and Jeff McNeil. They didn't get a ton of playing time.
Yeah.
Mc- McNeil in the last couple of games, he actually came up in a couple of big spots and drew walks, which is he had 4 walks in his last 5 plate appearances, which is just unheard of for Jeff McNeil.
He knew
Um,
his role, though, especially in that inning. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it in a moment, but even in that inning with where everyone was looking forward toward Otani versus Trout, if Mookie Betts hadn't grounded out, Trout would have come up as the winning run, not just the tying run. You know, he kind of knew his role. He worked out that at bat really well against Otani.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see if we see. I mean, Jeff McNeil has gone through adjustments like every year. Um, After once he got finally healthy in the minor leagues, he kind of I think understood that one of the best ways to get on a major league radar is to show some pop. So the year he came up to the big leagues, he had 20 home runs. Like he had quite a bit of power, and that's a big reason why he made it to the big leagues.
Yeah, I remember both he and Pete Alonso were just like trying to pace each other essentially. That last year they were both in the minors for the full year.
Yeah, and now last year Jeff McNeil won a batting title, and now that they're limiting shifts, what is this the new wrinkle we're going to see from Jeff McNeil? Is that
Mm,
he's going to take more walks? Is that
mm.
something he's worked on this offseason? That would be definitely very interesting because he's a guy that and I don't think he's not capable of walking. I think that's just he has found that ambushing early in the count is good for him getting on base via hits. So certainly be interesting. Pete got a couple of hits late in the tournament, kind of at least give him some positive thoughts. At least it was kind of tough for him. I mean, they had you have Paul Goldschmidt at first base. I mean, it's tough to play Alonso over Goldschmidt. And then they had Kyle Schwarber at DH, and Schwarber hit a couple of home runs in the tournament and had a monster year too. So I mean, DeRosa was kind of in a tough spot with McNeil and Alonso. I think you could probably argue McNeil over Tim Anderson was probably the better play there. I think you can certainly argue that more than Alonso over Goldschmidt.
Yeah.
Ottavino pitched well in the few appearances that he got in. Um, Other than that, there wasn't a ton of big leaguers, Mets big leaguers involved. Jonathan Arau, he actually had a
Arrows,
fair,
yeah.
yeah, he had a fairly good tournament for Panama, hitting right around Ruben Tejada, who had a really good tournament.
Yeah.
A blast from the past. Dilson Herrera had a home run in the tournament. Yoenis Cespedes pulled out for personal reasons. Um, oh, oh, again, I mean, we haven't
Yeah.
heard anything, but it was just kind of interesting, I guess, that they moved on to pool play, and then Cespedes decided he wasn't going to travel with the team. But yeah, between the Mets ties and the big home runs, I mean, we got to see. I think one of the things that I pull from it the most, and I think some baseball fans see now, is just how good Japan is,
Yes.
and just how good their pitching is. I mean, I'm glad that Kodai Senga didn't play simply because he needed to come over here and to the U.S. and adjust to all the different stuff, and he wanted to do it with the Mets and their coaching
Hmm.
staff. That makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Um, and also the fact that he's probably the number four starter on that team. That's how good their pitching is. I mean, you have Otani, you have Darvish, you have Sasaki,
And
um,
then Senga.
and yeah, and I mean, there's a couple other pitchers you could argue that might be better than Senga too, especially from the Japanese from
Hmm.
their team standpoint. So,
Yeah, and I mean,
and
Seiya Suzuki didn't even play. He probably would have been batting second for them. Like
yeah,
they would have had like a 1 through 5 that's just as good as anybody else's 1 through 5 in terms of, especially in like a short tournament like that.
well, yeah, I mean, you had Yoshida who just had a terrific tournament coming off signing with the Red Sox, and
Hmm.
Murakami was cold most of the tournament, and then all of a sudden decided to turn it on when it mattered the most, and just had two of the biggest hits of the tournament in the entire tournament. And I mean, you can't. I mean, we can't talk about enough about Shohei Ohtani. What
Yes.
he not just only what he did in the championship game, um, but to do what he did in the entire tournament. He had the tied for the hardest ball thrown at 102. He was tied for the longest hit ball at 448 with Juan Soto for a home run, and he had the hardest hit ball at 118. I mean, if I think most people already knew just how good Shohei Ohtani was, but to kind of finally see it on that level because the Angels never make the playoffs. So to finally see Ohtani be able to show himself off in games like that were so high intensity, and then the final matchup there between teammates and the two best players on the planet. I mean, that you couldn't have written a script any better than that.
Yeah.
Obviously, from a United States side, we would have liked to seen Trout hit a game tying home run there or whatever. But I mean,
I think that would have been equally as well received, and people would have reacted, the same way that they did if Otani struck him out, right? Like I mean, you had brought up earlier that obviously as Mets fans, it's tough, like that could have happened to any player on the team. Thank God it didn't happen to someone like Lindor. It could have happened to anybody, and any other team would have felt that way. And obviously, it hurts a little bit more because you're heading into a season where you expect to make it to the World Series, right? But if you're able to step outside of that eventually, then and we'll talk more about Edwin Diaz in a moment, but if you're able to step outside of that, it's it's only beneficial to the game of baseball, just how well this tournament went. I think the fact that there was 6 years between the last one, obviously the last one got canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the fact that there was 6 years and then it was so good. I mean, I think in 2026 there will be very high expectations, but the exposure, the don't underestimate the social media impact that this has, because that nowadays is how the game grows. Um, I'm sorry, basketball has far, far, far exceeded. Um, it's almost on par with football in terms of like social media followings and stuff. And baseball needs to get there. Some of their most interacted content ever came over the last 2 weeks. And it just came from like things that were happening in like a Japan versus Korea game, and like an Italy versus another team game, and a USA game versus Cuba and stuff like that. Like all very important moments, but as you said, it's so important for the game to obviously, like us as baseball followers, we are aware of many of these people. I think there were definitely some Japanese players, and there were definitely some Korean players, and there were definitely some people who I didn't know were from Mexico or had Mexican affiliations. Like I learned a lot about these kind of players, and there will just be so many people who will kind of look back fondly on that. Just as honestly, probably a lot of Mets fans look back very fondly about David Wright and being Captain America, and like especially when the Mets were not good in those times, that those are just like very special moments that we get to look back fondly on. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and like you
that's
said, I think social media um, played a big part in this. Like you
yes,
said, someone tweeted out was talking about how like I think it was 7 or 8 of MLB's top viewed tweets of the last year were from the WBC. And I mean, that's comparing it to other big moments like Astros winning the World Series and other big moments that have happened over the year. And another person was talking about just how many like Instagram followers Otani picked up, and the numbers were crazy from this on a
yes,
social media platform. And like you said, that's kind of where baseball has kind of lacked in marketing compared to sports like you said, NBA and NFL that do a really good job of not only marketing themselves but marketing key players. And I think maybe that's where that final at bat just kind of really brought everything together because you had the two best players in the world and you got to see them against each other, and that kind of marketed them to people that don't always see them like we talked about. I mean, they play the Angels who haven't won anything while the two have been there, and they're a West Coast team, so not everyone gets a chance to watch them play. So just being able to see both of those guys on the world stage was just I, it was just amazing. And to kind of
yeah,
cap it, I think this is a really important step going forward because they're doing it in 3 years this time, only 3 years in between. So, uh, really a stepping stone for 2026. And I think another really important thing to note is how much the players have enjoyed this and how much the
yes.
players have talked about. I mean, we've gotten marquee superstars talking about this is the best thing they've done in their baseball career. We're talking about guys that have World Series rings that are saying this is the best thing they have ever participated
I
in.
mean, Adam
And
Wainwright, how many rings does he have? And he's just like, I mean, granted, he's like 40 now, but he's just like, this is like the coolest thing that I've ever done in baseball.
yeah, exactly. And just, I think it's really important to, even if you didn't care about this, or you didn't enjoy it as much, I think it's important to see how much that the players enjoyed it and how much they felt like representing their country was a big deal. I mean, let's face it, it's not the same thing in baseball, or it wasn't the same thing until recently in baseball with players having an opportunity to represent their country. Um, with basketball and hockey with the Olympics. So, I mean, baseball players don't have the same opportunity at a professional level until recently to do that. So, I think the players, the way they felt about this and the way we've seen how emotional they were about the results of these games and just playing, I think 2026, I think you're going to see more marquee players
Yes.
play. I think
And
that's
potentially even pitchers, because I know, at least in terms of the United States, there were a lot of pitchers who set up honestly somewhat reasonably. Like you think of the Verlanders, the Degroms, and the Scherzers of the world. Like they're older, and they want to save things up, but like save their bullets for the regular season. But I think you're absolutely right that there will be more stars participating.
yeah, and that, like you said, kind of the U.S. kind of got into a weird spot where a lot of their marquee pitchers right now are kind of just on the older end of the spectrum, and rightfully so, like you said, wanted to kind of just focus on the season. But I mean, all it takes is for some of those guys to see what the U.S. team went through and talk to those guys.
Yes.
Well, that's the other thing too, is when these guys get back to camp and they're like, "Wow, you really got to be a part of this next time," or
Yeah.
as much fun as we had, the pride that we showed being able to play for our country, that's something you're not going to want to miss next time. So
Yeah.
I do think we're going to see a team like USA potentially even be better. I mean, obviously the starting rotation for them was the weak spot. Um, but yeah, I mean to put a bow on it, I think as Mets fans, it's certainly okay for them to be frustrated that Diaz happened, but I also don't think it was a WBC injury. Like this was just something that was freak. I mean, Steve Cohen even talked about it today on a podcast with John Heyman. And he was talking about how much he loved the WBC and how much he thinks it's great for baseball, and that he can't be mad at the Diaz situation because it was just a freak injury that no one saw happening. Wasn't unpreventable. Like he wasn't even really celebrating when it happened. So it was just a really unfortunate thing
Yeah.
that happened. And in fact, I mean, I tweeted out that Cohen was in Japan for the game between Japan and Italy. He said today that he just happened to be going to Japan for a work trip anyway for point 72, and he was able to take his daughters and kind of make it a family day at the park and talked about just how awesome it was to watch a game in that type of atmosphere.
Yeah, that's amazing, and we'll talk about Edwin Diaz a little bit more and potential Mets replacements in just a second. But to kind of wrap it up, I think you brought up a very good point about like there were a lot of marquee stars, and when we talk about marquee stars, we're talking about American marquee stars because you saw the Dominican Republic lineup. Like Vlad Jr. would have been in there, but he was injured. Like Sandy Alcantara's pitching for them. Um, any non-American marquee star for the most part was playing for their home team. And you brought it up how much it means to the players in their countries. We definitely, as Americans, like we even talked about. I even talked about being able to watch these last couple of games with like no real rooting interest. Like yeah, it'd be nice if the United States won, but it's not the end of the world. And not to say that it's the end of the world for fans of other countries, but it's very clear how much it means to other people. And so, like, we can also have that level of perspective too, where it's like, okay, like this tournament means a lot more to then just like my interests and in the Mets and like my interests in like the upcoming MLB season. Like for 95% of the rest of the world, this is the big moment, right? This is bigger than KBO, this is bigger than the NPB, this is bigger than like the Mexican league, this is bigger than the Dominican Winter League, this is bigger than the Caribbean series. So yeah, I just wanted to you made an excellent point about like the players themselves having so much pride. And that ideally, us as a general baseball community can potentially have a better perspective going into the next one. So Edwin Diaz, he's out for the year. That's, I think, the mindset that everybody should have. I bet Edwin Diaz himself would like to try to be back in October. That would be about 6.5 to 7 months. It's not unprecedented based on previous precedent, but the average time for a torn patellar tendon is about 8 months. It happened on his push-off leg, and there was actually an interesting article in the Athletic today where Matt Strom has actually he's on the Phillies now, but he has torn his patellar tendon in each knee, and he said that yeah, bad luck, but he said that his recovery for his push-off leg was a lot better and was faster in a sense than his landing leg. And obviously Diaz's right leg is his push-off leg. There was also another story about how the Mets were able to get him surgery basically within 24 hours. And the quicker you can have surgery on that type of tear, the better. He had it basically within 24 hours, if not 36 hours. So those are all good signs. That is to say, the Mets should operate like he's not going to pitch again until 2024. So with that being said, it's been about a week now. The only real move they've made in terms of the bullpen is acquiring Dennis Santana off waivers. That is not an Edwin Diaz replacement. I think we should go into this next part saying that there is no Edwin Diaz replacement. He was the best reliever in baseball last year, and unless you're acquiring the best reliever in baseball, there's obviously no exact replacement. But What are some names that you think, Mike, whether it's free agency, not free agency, whether it's trade, whether it's eventually, via the waiver wire or something like that, God forbid, within the organization, who can replace 70% of Diaz's value? Because at this point, the Mets are very much going to have to patchwork together a bullpen until, at the very least, they aren't viewed as in panic mode and trying to make a trade.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard this time of year to make trades of that caliber player. I mean, we've seen the Mets make trades for bullpen arms this time of year. I mean, they did two in like 1 week with Jerry Blevins and Alex Torres when they got both of them. Um, so even if you're looking at trades, that's really like the type of thing that's
Yeah.
probably available is that like depth arm piece, which is, I mean,
Yes.
essentially what they got with Dennis Santana.
Yes.
He's a guy that has good velocity, even though his fastball got hit a little bit last year. But he's got a good slider and a good change. His pitch mix is actually kind of similar to Miguel Castro, looking at the data and in the fact that the fastball actually got hit a little bit. Um, his velocity isn't quite Miguel Castro level, but I mean, he's an interesting arm to get on waivers. Bubby Rossman, who I mentioned previously, pitched for Team Israel. He's a guy, he pitched for the Phillies briefly last year, made his big league debut. He's been up to 99 with his fastball too. Again, that's just like that's a depth piece.
Yeah.
Um, I know everyone wants to talk about like Alexis Diaz or Daniel Bard or David Bednar, or I mean, you can throw out a bunch of different names out there. Of Scott Barlow from the Royals is another one that we wrote about. Um, all these guys have multiple years of control, so it's going to cost a lot in trade, especially Alexis Diaz. I think he has 5 years of control. I
Yeah.
mean, you're talking about a significant package. I know, like someone mentioned, like Mark Vientos, and I'm like, well, Mark Vientos isn't getting you 5 years of Alexis Diaz, so that's kind of where you have to be in like your headspace is thinking about just how much it is going to be to acquire that type of arm.
Yeah.
Um, I think the good news for the Mets is that they built really good bullpen depth this offseason.
Yes.
Not just bullpen depth, but they acquired. I mean, Ottavino they re-signed. Obviously, has some closing experience. David Robertson was closing games for the Phillies, who made it to the World Series. Brooks Raley has closed some games in the past too. So they have three pretty good options there of to I don't want to use the word ever to replace Diaz because like you said you can't replace what he did last year and you can't another good point is you can't replace what Edwin Diaz is too. You can't replace what
Yes.
he brought to City Field, what he brought to the team, um, what he brought to marketing for the Mets in terms of narco and all of that. You're not replacing any of that. The best thing you can do is try to get a closer that is gonna be able to be successful in safe situations and have an ERA around like 250. That's what you are hoping for.
Yeah.
Um, and like I said, I mean, they have some decent in-house options to be able to get that production with those three guys I mentioned. And then you got to hope someone else steps up. Drew Smith, hopefully he can finally stay healthy. John Curtis is a guy that has looked really good this spring. He looks healthy coming off Tommy John. Tommy Hunter's looked good this spring. Another depth piece. Unfortunately, I mean, if you're talking like closer type material from the minor leagues, that's Bryce Montez de Oca, and
Yes.
he has a stress reaction that essentially he'll be shut down for a month. And I think we're about a week, maybe a week and a half into that, and then kind of see where he's at from there. He's really the only guy in the minor leagues that you see and be like, hey, this guy could end up being a closer.
Yeah.
They do have Grant Hartwick, who we saw early this spring, who's got a good high spin fastball and a really nice slider that I do think he pitches at the major league level. They also have Eric Orsey, who we saw in spring too. That's a fastball splitter combo. But yeah, I think the replacement starts with David Robertson, Adam Ottavino, Brooks Raley, and those three guys you have to hope you can kind of mix and match and get the saves from.
Oh, hello. There's a big Bryce Montez de Oca fan over there.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, honestly, like I think you're 100% right. I think it's going to have to be a patchwork. Two things. This just goes to show you all those 40-man roster moves, like in the dead of winter, that Billy Epler and team were making, the William Woods, the Stephen Ridings, the this that they were signing Tommy Hunter to a minor league contract. They were basically trading Jake Mangum to get Jeff Brigham and Eliezer Hernandez. This is all very important because even this Sam Coonrod, who was not on the 40-man roster, um, even though he's injured, like those are the type of moves that you make. He was looking really good before that lat strain. Secondly, sorry. Sorry, I forgot what I was going to say, but basically, like, ideally, you won't be able to replace. Oh, I remembered what I was going to say now. I wonder if this is going to force Buck Showalter to be a little less conventional with his bullpen, and I mean less conventional in the Buck Showalter way. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, Edwin Diaz is the closer. That's it. But I wonder if he identifies someone like David Robertson, Adam Ottavino, and says, you're going to be the guy who's going to get these guys out tonight in the seventh inning. Because sometimes the highest leverage spot in a game comes in the sixth inning or the seventh inning. And I wonder if he'll be a little bit more malleable as opposed to, all right, you know what, David Robinson's our closer. We're going to go with that, and we're going to go with that until the wheels fall off or they don't. So I wonder if like Ottavino will pitch in the sixth inning some nights and ninth innings the other nights, and if Robertson will do the same, and if Raley will do the same, and if Drew Smith will do the same, kind of depending on
Well,
matchups in those innings.
and honestly, I think that's what the roster allows him to do. I think
Yes.
that's what it pushes him to, because unless, I mean, outside of him just naming David Robertson the closer because of his experience there, outside of doing that, you would think he's going to have the mindset of having those three guys and whoever else steps up to be in those high leverage spots. So I think that kind of allows itself to be um, to essentially do matchups. I mean, they're all obviously Rayleigh's a lefty, so he's a little bit different. So you can use him in spots against lefty hefty um, ninth inning lineups or eighth inning lineups, seventh inning lineups. And there's a little bit of difference between Ottavino and Robertson too. I mean, Ottavino's kind of bread and butter is a slider, and we know with Robertson his is a curveball. So I mean, you can kind of play the matchups to those two degrees too, and kind of try to play off those two. And when you have Drew Smith, he's more of a fastball cutter guy. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what he's going to have to do is we're going to have to see kind of Buck Showalter be flexible with what he can do in the bullpen. And if a guy steps up, like we haven't seen Stephen Ridings yet, who they picked up from the Yankees. He might not pitch in spring training, but he could be ready in the next month or so. That's another live arm that they have, another really hard thrower that, when healthy, has looked really good. So that's a guy that could throw his hat in the ring too. I mean, there's, like you said, they built some pretty good depth this offseason. I would say that the Mets will certainly keep an eye out. I mean, in the next 3 to 4 days, you're going to see a lot of guys either go on waivers or you're going to see veterans um, hit free agency again because I think, well, now there's just scheduled opt-outs, and I believe Saturday is like the first one where players can, like Tommy Hunter, can opt out if he decides to, if he's
Yeah.
not added to the 40s. So, I mean, we're going to see players hit free agency, and it'll be interesting to see how aggressive the Mets are there. And we still, I mean, we haven't heard the end of Zach Britton yet either. I mean,
Yeah.
until he signs with someone, I feel like it just makes too much sense for him to sign with the Mets, and that, especially now. I mean, obviously he has a history of pitching with um, Buck. The Mets really didn't have another lefty per se, and now they they need to just find anything they can
Yeah.
or try to find anything they can to improve in the bullpen. So I mean, Zach Britton makes a ton of sense too. But yeah, it's going to be meshing. It's going to be trying to piece things together all year. It's going to be doing lineups, matching lineups. Yeah, and I think you kind of once you get an idea of once you get to the deadline, I think Epler will probably have a pretty good idea of where Diaz is at if they can kind of count on him at all for the postseason, and then kind of go from there and what how aggressive he wants to be at the deadline. Because
There is always going to end up being a reliever at the deadline, a couple of relievers who are cheap to get. You know,
oh yeah, I mean it might
we'll
be the
see.
year that the Rockies finally trade Daniel Bard or they give him another 2 year extension. Um, but yeah, there's always guys with closer experience that are available at the deadline. And if Diaz has been slowed even a little bit, you know that you definitely need to add there anyway. And even if he's doing well, you probably add to the bullpen because that's just what contenders do is you always kind of pack up the bullpen and try to get as many good arms as you can for the stretch runs. So I think this just makes what was already going to be in a very important trade deadline. I think it makes it even more important for Billy Epler, who I know the Mets won 101 games last year, and you can certainly argue that he had a good offseason, but Steve Cohen has said that he wants to win and he wants to win soon. So if Epler has another situation this year where doesn't do enough at the deadline and the Mets don't make it as far as the World Series at the very least, I mean, Epler's going to be in a hot seat pretty quick. So I think this year he's going to have to be aggressive whether he wants to be or not.
Absolutely. In the name of roster construction with ideally we'll do another MMO weekly before the season starts next Thursday. Well, we're recording this Wednesday evening, so probably a week from the Thursday that it's being posted. I wanted to spend a couple minutes on probably the two primary questions, non-bullpen questions that the Mets have going into the season. The first, Brett Baty, Eduardo Escobar. I've been doing some roster projections, much to the chagrin of the MMO comment section often, at least in terms of the output. But at this point, Brett Baty's making the team. I don't think that's much of a question. I think it would be incredibly shocking if he didn't. At the beginning of spring, before spring training started, I said he'd have to have a Pete Alonso-esque spring training where it was no longer a question for Billy Epler. I think if he came back, obviously, because he had surgery on his finger, I believe, that's why he was out basically all of September. I think it would be very reasonable if he came and needed a couple weeks to, kind of just get the bat back under his hands. But he's hit the ground running. He's still hitting in the 300s. He's shown power, to all, the sides of the field. I'm pretty sure he's going to make the opening day roster. However, the question is, will he be starting at third base on opening day against the Miami Marlins? Or will Eduardo Escobar be starting at third base against the Miami Marlins?
So for me, so I'll give you two sides of this. I wrote a piece last week from when I was in spring training because every day I got there early and just went out to the backfields and you kind of just see what's happening. There's
Mm-hmm.
different guys throwing bullpens. There's minor leaguers stretching, getting ready. And then a lot of times there's a little practice field that's just an infield. And a lot of times there's potentially guys out there doing work. Well, every single day I went out there, it was Brett Baty doing work with either Eric Chavez, Joey Cora, Reed Brignac, who's a minor league coach who obviously played a lot of infield in the big leagues. He was out there every day working on his defense, and it showed. I mean, it showed over the last 2 weeks in these games, and he showed improved defense. He showed improved athleticism and first steps going to both his left and right. You can see it in some of the highlight plays in the last 2 weeks. And he kind of said that he just had an epiphany that he realized he was just kind of putting too much pressure on himself about playing his defense. And it sounds like it's really helped to have a guy like Eric Chavez. I mean, it can't hurt. This
Yes,
is a guy that's won a lot of Gold Gloves at the position he plays. So to be able to have him in your ear all the time is just, I mean, that's a great resource for Brett Beatty. Howard Johnson was in camp to talk to him. Edgardo Alfonso, David Wright, all of these guys that have played a lot of third base, and all of them played it pretty well. Um, so I think I don't think it's a given that he's going to make the opening day roster from the Mets standpoint. I don't
interesting.
think that's a given from what I've been told. I think they like Eduardo Escobar a lot. Um, they like his veteran leadership. They like what he brings to the table. Um, I mean, that said, if Beatty is on the opening day roster, I gotta believe that it's mostly as a he's gonna play a lot of third
Yes,
base. I mean, certainly, I think they would certainly still use Escobar against some tough lefties, and that's how you kind of slowly mix Beatty into being a big leaguer. But yeah, I still don't think that the Mets have made that decision, and we're getting pretty close. There's only a
yes,
handful of spring training games yet, and um, the last couple of days, Escobar has played third and hit first in the lineup because they wanted to get him at bats coming from the WBC where he didn't play
mhm,
every day. And he kind of he struggled. He went 1 for 10 with a home run for Venezuela in the WBC. Um, and I mean, he struggled. It's spring training, so I'm not sure how much we need to play into it, but
yeah,
he struggled for the Mets too before today. Today he had a RBI double and a walk and looked good, but I think the key for the Mets here is Brett Beatty is going to be the third baseman at some point. He's their third baseman of the future.
yeah,
So at some point, you have to put him in that position. And I think really the ideal time, if you think he's ready, which I believe so, is to do it now. I don't think you need that lingering over him and Eduardo Escobar going into the season. I think the smart move is to tell both of those guys, look, Beatty's our third baseman. He's he's our third baseman now, and he's our third baseman long term, and that allows Eduardo Escobar to realize that hey, he's going to be kind of that super utility guy, which he's
yeah,
done. He has experience at least at all nine positions. Um, we've seen when the Mets signed him, they actually, depending on what moves happened, they liked him better at second base. And it was possibility of him going there. So he can play second. He's played some short. He's played some first. The Mets had him out in left field earlier this spring. So he's the type of guy that he's still athletic enough. He moves well enough that he can play a bunch of different positions. And I think that makes the Mets bench better
yeah,
because the next topic that I think we're going to talk about is Darin Ruf. And I certainly think that Eduardo Escobar as your primary one of your primary guys off the bench certainly is an improvement over Darin Ruf.
yeah. Who can at that point like? I don't really care if he's a backup first baseman, but we'll get to him in just a second. But I totally agree. It's very interesting that you don't think it's a slam dunk just yet. Um, I like in my eyes, he's already his clock has already started, right? You know, like he came up to the big leagues last year. There's really no huge sense in holding him back. However, just because he starts on opening day, or just because someone like Eduardo Escobar starts on opening day, does not mean that I think that Eduardo Escobar will be playing third base the majority of the time. I do think eventually that ends up with Brett Beatty. Your piece on his improved defense, and then it's showing. Um, Obviously, where Brett Beatty started at third base is not where Pete Alonso started at first base, but in that last spring, in between his I believe for Alonso, it was in between his 2018 season and 2019 spring training. He seemed like a vastly different defender, and not that Brett Beatty was incapable at third base, but I think there were some level of questions of is he going to stay here long term? But it seems like this spring, a lot of people, yourself, other scouts, have really just been like, no, he definitely seems like he could stay there for a while. So between that and then him coming out just, guns a blazing with his bat, I personally think he will make that. I don't think it's as much of a question as the Mets think it is. I don't think having him on the roster then affects Eduardo Escobar a whole bunch. It's Escobar's last year with the team for now. I mean, who knows? Maybe he'll want to come back next year, but he signed a 2-year deal. And Brett Baty, there's no sense in kind of just waiting another year just to get Eduardo Escobar, 200 extra plate appearances. That if Brett Baty wasn't there, they'll still find him at bats. But who might
Well,
not
yeah,
get?
and
Go ahead.
yeah, and I think I didn't even mention Brett Baty's offense, which I think,
Yeah, yeah.
which kind of just tells you about like how I feel about his offense. I think he's a good major league hitter. I think he is right now. I think he's a better hitter than Eduardo Escobar in the major leagues right now.
Yeah.
Um, I think he's probably going to be early in his career. I mean, he's a younger player, but I think he's still at least a 115 weighted runs created plus type hitter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a chance that he's a 125 guy, which brings a lot of value.
Yes.
Escobar's probably, I think last year it was like 105.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably where he is in his career. And I think another key point that kind of gets forgotten is a lot of people talked about Brett Baty's defense at third base and how it wasn't good last year in a small sample and people worried about it. But Eduardo Escobar was one of the worst defensive third basemen in baseball last year.
Yep.
That was after a below average year the year before. Now he's 34. I mean, I don't see him getting better defensively at 34. So they shouldn't really be. I don't think Escobar is any better defensively than Baty at third either. I mean, they're different defensively. Like Escobar is more short-handed, but he doesn't get to some of those balls that you've seen the past couple of weeks of Baty going to his left and making good throws, or a couple of plays where he backed up on the ball and made good throws. I think in the long run he has a better arm than Escobar at third too. So I think kind of what we're both saying here is that Baty is that guy, so it doesn't make any sense to keep putting off this decision. Like the Mets should make it now, and that's ultimately where I'm at. And I would like to think that the Mets are at. It'll we'll see where they're at. This is kind of Buck's first opportunity to be like, well, am I going to go with the veteran guy, or am I going to go with that rookie? He's never really had that decision to make before. So this is really that first big one for him to see where he's going to land on that spectrum, because we know we've seen it. Eduardo Escobar is loved by his teammates. He
Mm-hmm.
just is. He's an everyone likes his personality. I mean, anytime you post anything on social media from MMO, people love it. Escobar is
Yes.
just a guy that, like, if you were going to hang out with a Met player, he'd be like a top of the list. Um, but that's good. That means he's going to be able to be that bench player. He's going to have that great personality no matter where he is. So I think that actually makes the decision easier for the Mets, because sometimes you know that there's veterans that aren't going to be taking that well, to be like,
Yes.
you're not a starter for the first time in your career, which is
Yes.
essentially what it would be for Escobar. Some players would take that to the bench to them and kind of be a cancer with it, or kind of be an issue. And Eduardo Escobar is not going to be that player. So
No.
I think that kind of helps the Mets' decision in that regard.
Yeah, and so I think this ties to Darin Ruf in the sense that if Brett Baty does make the opening day roster, I think it comes at the expense of Darin Ruf, because I just don't see any other avenue, especially the way the bullpen is now. I don't think they can run short in the bullpen.
No.
The way the bench is currently set up, which you imagine, we'll see if Brandon Nimmo makes that. If Brandon Nimmo makes the opening day roster, then this will probably be the benches. One of Omar Narvaez or Tomas Nido. It's Luis Guillorme. It's Tommy Pham, because they paid him $6 million or something. They're not cutting him before the season starts. And there's one guy left. And that is either Eduardo Escobar, Brett Baty, however you look at it, it's one of them. So, is there room for Darin Ruf on the roster as currently constructed? Like, I mean, if he came out, basically everything you didn't want to happen with Darin Ruf this spring has happened. You kind of wanted him to show up. You wanted to show some pop, things like that. Um, he took him about an extra week or so to get into a game because he was just because of his wrist, which he basically said will never be fully healed. It's something he's dealt with for a while, and you know he didn't get too specific with it, but he said it's something that's always lingering. It comes and goes. He hasn't shown a ton of pop. He's struck out a lot. Um, is there room for him?
I think again, if the Mets are making the baseball decision here and not thinking about the ridiculous package that they gave up for Darin Ruf, and they're only focused on winning games in 2023, I just don't. The only way that Darin Ruf stays in the Mets organization or should stay in the Mets organization is if they figure out that they're going to put him on the injured list to start the year. Like you mentioned, his
Hmm.
this is a wrist injury that's kind of essentially sounds like it's been nagging him. When I was down in Port St. Lucie and just watching him take BP, um, it didn't even look like he was taking full swings any of the
Hmm.
time. Some guys are working on stuff in BP at different times, aren't swinging 100%. Um, and then kind of at the end, a lot of guys, the last round, that's where guys kind of tee off in the same group. Mauricio hit 5 balls out in a row at the end when he was touching it off. Darin Ruf, I mean, he just didn't even show power in batting practice. And to
Hmm.
me, that is just a sign of a guy that is just not healthy anymore. And I mean, that stinks for him and that stinks for the Mets because the ultimate reason why they got him to mash lefties is a good fit for the Mets. I mean, that would have helped a lot last year and it could potentially this year, but I don't think that you can go into the 2023 season with Ruff on the roster. I mean, and it's not just, I mean, we're talking about Beatty. I think you could make an argument um, for Mark Vientos making over him. He showed a ton of power um, during the spring. He's actually in the top 10 in hard hit balls this spring. I talked about Beatty doing a ton of infield work. Vientos has been right out there with him too, almost
Yeah.
all of the time. He's been working hard too at first base, and he's even played a little bit of third. So, and then you got guys like Tim LeCastro. We could talk about him certainly being a better use of a roster spot than Darin Ruf right now. Um,
Absolutely.
it gives the Mets speed, defense off the bench. DJ Stewart, if you really want to make an argument for him too, I mean, he's had a fantastic spring and he gives you more flexibility because he can play the outfield. And I don't think Ruff's really in a spot at this age. I mean, we're also talking about a guy that's 36 years old. I don't think he's going to be playing a ton of outfield.
Yeah.
And I saw Stewart. I'm not sure if he got in a game there, but that same backfield, Stewart was doing some work at first base too. So, I mean, the Mets know that essentially if they want one of those outfield type corner pieces that they're going to need to place them first. That Hannah's been over there too. They know they need
Yes.
some backup there. So ultimately, I think Ruff is either DFA'd or he starts on the IL. There's just no way I see him fitting onto the roster.
Yeah. And who knows that like it would be a very grown up thing for the Mets to do to, as you had mentioned, like purely make a baseball decision. Don't look at what you kind of gave up. You kind of don't. It's not at the point where like Robinson Cano was last year, where the Mets owed him a ton of money, so they're going to at least give him some level of a chance. If you don't see it in spring training, then like you said, maybe he starts on the injured list, and you kind of give him some time to actually rest his wrist, and give him a ton of games in Syracuse or something on a rehab assignment to really get his legs and hands back under him. But Yeah, after all those names that you had rattled off that are, especially at this point, pretty clearly better decisions or better places or pieces that you could put on the roster, and most of those guys should just be in Syracuse. That I think that just about answers our question. Probably by the next time we have an MMO Weekly, we'll have a much clearer outlook on the roster. But that'll be it for this week. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.